At a quiet town square in the deep south, a lone black man leans against a lamppost, his hands cuffed and his gaze steady. Around him, 2 officers, a crowd gathers, some sneering, others recording on their phones as 2 smug cops put on a show, mocking and humiliating him. What they don't know is that this man isn't just a drifter or an outsider, they've just humiliated their new chief of police. And by the time the day is over, the entire town will realize they've picked a fight with the wrong man. Ezekiel Vance's arrival in Rustwood, Mississippi, was unceremonious, just the way he wanted it. The rental truck hummed down the lone highway, cutting through miles of pine forests and cotton fields, its tires kicking up little puffs of dust that hung in the humid summer air. The heat pressed down like a wet blanket, sweat trickled down his dark brown skin, but Ezekiel didn't mind. He'd faced worse, much worse. He glanced at the cracked leather duffel bag sitting on the passenger seat, the only thing he'd bothered unpacking so far. It held his badge, his uniform, and a photo of his late son, Andre. That photo weighed more than anything else in the truck. Ezekiel gripped the steering wheel a little tighter and focused on the road ahead. The Welcome to Rustwood sign appeared on the horizon, white letters faded and chipped, the rusted bolts barely holding it up. Underneath it, someone had scrawled, "Keep it clean. Keep it local," in bright red spray paint. Ezekiel exhaled sharply through his nose. He'd read the reports about this place before taking the job, and those 7 words told him more than any official briefing ever could. The main drag of Rustwood looked like it had been frozen in time. Brick buildings leaned slightly inward, their faded signs promising home-cooked meals and handcrafted goods. The diner on the corner, Maggie's Place, had a line of rocking chairs out front, occupied by men in ball caps and denim overalls who barely looked up as Ezekiel's truck rolled by. He found the motel without much trouble, Rustwood Inn, a squat, 2-story building with peeling paint and a neon vacancy sign buzzing faintly. The woman at the front desk didn't bother to hide her curiosity as he signed in. "Passing through?" she asked, her voice tight and clipped. "Moving in," Ezekiel replied, keeping his tone even. "Taking the job at the station." Her eyes widened slightly before she caught herself. "Oh, you're the new chief." "Yeah. Didn't expect you until Monday. Wanted to get a feel for the place first." She handed him the key and managed a half-hearted smile, but Ezekiel noticed how her gaze lingered just a second too long before she turned away. He was used to it. Towns like this didn't handle change well, and he was a walking, talking disruption to their routine. Later that evening, Ezekiel decided to walk the streets, blending in or trying to, anyway. He dressed down in an old flannel shirt and jeans, pulling a faded baseball cap low over his eyes. The streets were quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon, but even in the dimming light, he felt the eyes. Windows twitched. Heads turned. Whispers carried. He ducked into Maggie's Place, figuring coffee would help him shake the long drive. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the din of conversation dipped just enough for him to notice before rising again. The interior was as he expected: linoleum floors, checkered tablecloths, and walls covered in yellowed newspaper clippings and photos of the high school football team. But it wasn't the decor that held Ezekiel's attention. It was the 2 cops in the corner booth. They weren't in uniform, but the polished leather holsters and shiny belt buckles gave them away. The tall one, Bryce Tanner, was mid-laugh, leaning back with an arm draped over the booth. His partner, Calvin Ross, was built like a bulldozer, all shoulders and neck, shoveling fries into his mouth like he was fueling up for a fight. Both men stopped when they saw Ezekiel. Bryce's eyes narrowed as he nudged Calvin with his elbow. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn," Bryce said, loud enough for Ezekiel and the rest of the diner to hear. Ezekiel ignored him and walked up to the counter. He ordered a coffee, leaning on the worn formica surface while the waitress filled his cup. Bryce and Calvin didn't stop talking, though now their voices were lower, more deliberate. "Bet he's lost," Calvin muttered. "Or looking for trouble." Ezekiel sipped his coffee, letting their words roll off his back. He'd dealt with men like them before, big fish in small ponds who thrived on intimidation and a misplaced sense of power. But he wasn't here to start a fight. Not yet. As he turned to leave, Bryce called out again. "Hey, old man, you sure you're in the right place? Don't see too many strangers hanging around after dark." Ezekiel stopped, his fingers tightening around the cup, but he didn't look back. "Just passing through," he said, his voice calm but firm. He walked out, but he felt their eyes burning into his back the whole way down the street. The next morning, Ezekiel laced up his running shoes and hit the road before the town fully woke up. The air was thick and sticky, but the rhythm of his steps helped him clear his head. He'd always relied on running to think things through, to center himself. But his peace didn't last long. Halfway through his route, the low rumble of a patrol car crept up behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The cruiser pulled alongside him, rolling slowly to match his pace. Bryce leaned out the window, flashing the same grin from the diner. "Morning, runner. You lost." Ezekiel slowed to a jog, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Just getting some air." Calvin leaned across Bryce, his voice a low growl. "You sure you're welcome around here?" Ezekiel met their eyes, his gaze steady. "Pretty sure running's still legal." Calvin snorted. "Depends on who's doing it." Before Ezekiel could respond, Bryce threw the car into park and hopped out, cutting him off on the sidewalk. "Let's see some ID," Bryce said, his hand resting near his holster. Ezekiel hesitated, considering his options, but he knew how this game worked. He pulled out his wallet, handing over his license without a word. Bryce studied it longer than necessary, then smirked. "Not from around here, huh? Figures." Calvin climbed out, circling around Ezekiel like a predator sizing up prey. "Mind if we check your pockets?" Bryce asked, already reaching for him. Ezekiel stepped back. "You got a reason for that?" Bryce's grin widened. "Yeah, because I said so." And before Ezekiel could react, Bryce shoved him against the car. Ezekiel Vance's instincts kicked in the moment Bryce Tanner shoved him against the patrol car. Years of training told him to stay calm, to measure every word and every movement. But the heat rising in his chest was hard to ignore. "Easy," Ezekiel said, his voice low and steady. "No need to make this worse than it already is." Bryce's smirk didn't falter. He leaned in close, his breath hot and sour. "Oh, I think you're the one who made it worse. Walking around like you own the place." Calvin Ross stepped up behind Ezekiel, crowding him. The man's bulk cast a long shadow, making the morning sun feel colder than it should have. "Let's see what you're hiding," Calvin said, his voice dripping with fake authority. Ezekiel clenched his jaw as Bryce's hands patted down his pockets, rougher than necessary, clearly enjoying the show. A few townsfolk had started to gather nearby, slowing their steps to watch. Some lingered on porches, pretending not to look while sneaking glances over their coffee cups. Then Bryce pulled something out of Ezekiel's jacket pocket, a small plastic bag with a broken zip tie dangling from it. "Well, well," Bryce said, holding it up like a trophy. "Looks like we've got ourselves a thief." Ezekiel's eyes locked on the bag, his stomach sinking. He recognized it immediately. It was trash, something that must have fallen into his jacket pocket at some point during the move. It wasn't evidence of a crime, but that didn't matter. Not to men like Bryce and Calvin. "You're making a mistake," Ezekiel said. Bryce barked a laugh and turned to the growing crowd. "You hear that? He thinks we're the ones making mistakes." Calvin clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, Bryce. Let's show this guy how we do things around here." Before Ezekiel could protest, they each grabbed an arm and yanked him forward. The cuffs snapped tight around his wrists. The walk back into town felt longer than the road Ezekiel had driven to get here. Bryce and Calvin made sure of that, parading him through the streets like a prize catch. The crowd grew as they reached the center of town, men, women, and teenagers pausing their errands to see what the commotion was about. Some whispered behind their hands. Others pointed openly, their phones raised to record every step Ezekiel took. Ezekiel kept his head high, refusing to let them see the anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew the videos would spread, knew his face would be plastered across social media within hours. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. Bryce and Calvin led him to the town square, where a rusted lamppost stood like a relic from another century. They pushed him against it, securing the cuffs around the post for all to see. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bryce called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Looks like we've got ourselves a troublemaker in Rustwood." Calvin leaned in, his voice loud enough for the crowd but meant just for Ezekiel. "You're not the first to step out of line in this town, and you won't be the last." Ezekiel stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. "And you're not the first two-bit bully I've dealt with." Calvin's grin faltered, but Bryce covered it with a laugh. "Oh, he's got jokes." Bryce turned to the crowd. "Maybe he'll be less funny after a night cooling off." Someone in the crowd yelled, "Get him out here." Others laughed. A few even cheered. But Ezekiel caught the nervous looks on some faces, the ones who weren't laughing, the ones who saw this for what it was. The phones kept recording. Ezekiel could see the lenses pointed his way, the red recording lights blinking like warning signals. He wasn't sure if he should be angry or grateful. He felt a vibration in his pocket. Calvin must not have checked his phone before locking him up. Good. That meant word was already spreading. A teenager stepped closer, holding her phone steady. "What did he do?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Bryce turned toward her, puffing out his chest. "Disturbing the peace," he said, "and resisting arrest." The girl frowned. "Doesn't look like he's resisting now." Calvin pointed at her. "You got a problem." She stepped back but didn't stop recording. Hours passed. Ezekiel's legs ached, but he refused to sag against the pole. Bryce and Calvin lingered nearby, cracking jokes with passers-by and flashing smug smiles for the cameras. By the time the sun dipped low, Ezekiel had counted at least 24 videos uploaded online. Comments were already rolling in, some defending the cops, others demanding answers. Then the first reporter showed up. A woman with sharp features and a microphone that looked too large for her hands pushed through the crowd. "Excuse me," she called out. "Is this a public arrest? What are the charges?" Bryce tried to brush her off, but she wasn't having it. "You're detaining someone in the middle of a public square. I think the people deserve an explanation." Ezekiel's lips twitched. The cracks in their armor were starting to show. By nightfall, the square was packed. The glow of phone screens lit up the crowd, and news vans lined the edges of the square. Ezekiel could hear the hum of their generators, the voices of anchors rehearsing their lines. Bryce's confidence was fading fast. He kept checking his phone, scrolling through comments and news alerts. Calvin was pacing, his fists clenching and unclenching. And Ezekiel waited. He knew the call would come. It was only a matter of time before someone higher up saw the footage. Someone who recognized him. Sure enough, just before midnight, his phone buzzed again. He didn't need to see the screen to know it was the district office. And by morning, Bryce and Calvin would be in for the shock of their lives. Ezekiel Vance barely slept that night. Not that he expected to. He'd spent enough years working homicide to know when a storm was about to hit, and this one had been brewing since the moment he stepped into Rustwood. The square had finally cleared out after midnight, but not before the local news trucks got their footage and interviews. By then, Ezekiel's arms were numb, and his wrists ached from the tight cuffs. Bryce and Calvin had eventually unchained him from the lamppost, but not without a final round of smug grins and taunts. "Don't wander too far," Bryce had said, patting Ezekiel on the shoulder like they were old friends. "We'll be keeping an eye on you." Ezekiel hadn't responded. He didn't need to. The fire in his eyes said enough. The next morning, Ezekiel Vance stood in his motel room, staring at himself in the mirror. His crisp, freshly pressed uniform seemed almost out of place in this town, a beacon of order in a sea of chaos. As he pinned the badge to his chest, he could feel its weight, heavier than the metal it was made of. It wasn't just responsibility, it was the knowledge that today would change everything. Taking a deep breath, Ezekiel adjusted his collar and stepped outside into the humid Mississippi morning. He walked with measured purpose toward the Rustwood Police Department, his boots striking the pavement in a steady rhythm. The weight of what he was about to do bore down on him, but he didn't falter. When Ezekiel entered the station, the atmosphere was surprisingly ordinary. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and low murmurs of conversation filled the room. Most of the officers barely glanced up. He was just another man walking through the door. Near the front desk stood Deputy Chief Hank Crowley, leaning on the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. His eyes flicked to Ezekiel, narrowing slightly as he took in the uniform. "Morning," Crowley said, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. "You must be Vance?" "That's right," Ezekiel replied, meeting his gaze evenly. Crowley gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. Figured you'd be in Monday. Guess you're early. I like to hit the ground running, Ezekiel said. Crowley's mouth twitched into what might have been a smile. Fair enough. Follow me. Without another word, Crowley turned and led Ezekiel through the station. The narrow hallways smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the walls lined with outdated posters and fading plaques. Officers glanced at them as they passed, their conversations halting mid-sentence as they noticed Ezekiel's uniform. When Ezekiel entered the station behind Crowley, his eyes caught the quiet figure of a young officer seated at a desk near the far wall. She was scanning a stack of reports, her sharp eyes flicking over the pages with precision. Unlike the other officers, who either avoided his gaze or glared openly, she spared him a brief, curious glance before returning to her work. "That's Harper," Crowley muttered over his shoulder, noticing Ezekiel's glance. "One of our newer recruits. Keeps her head down. Good kid, but a bit idealistic for my taste." Ezekiel made a mental note of her. In a room full of hostility and discomfort, she stood out not defiant, not submissive, but simply calm. Crowley pushed open the door to the meeting room, where a dozen officers sat or leaned against the walls, waiting. At the far end of the room, Bryce Tanner and Calvin Ross were slouched in their chairs, laughing over some shared joke. The sound of their laughter grated on Ezekiel's nerves, but he kept his face neutral. Crowley stepped inside and raised his voice. "All right, everyone, listen up. Got someone you need to meet." The room quieted, all eyes turning toward Ezekiel as he followed Crowley inside. "This," Crowley said, gesturing toward him, "is Ezekiel Vance. He's here too," he hesitated, clearing his throat. "Well, he's your new boss, Chief Vance." The room froze. Bryce sat up straighter, his face draining of color. Calvin's smirk faltered, confusion and unease flickering in his eyes. A low murmur rippled through the other officers as they processed the announcement. Ezekiel stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Good morning." The room fell silent again. He let the moment stretch, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers. Some met his eyes, others looked away, shifting uncomfortably. "I've been in this town less than a week," Ezekiel began, his tone steady, "and I've already seen more than enough to know things aren't running the way they should be." Bryce shifted in his seat, his lips parting like he wanted to say something, but Ezekiel cut him off with a sharp look. "Before anyone gets too comfortable, let's clear something up," Ezekiel continued. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. With a single tap, the video from the previous day began to play, the mocking voices, the laughter, the humiliation. The room watched in stunned silence as the events unfolded on the small screen. When the video ended, Ezekiel slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked directly at Bryce and Calvin. "Care to explain yourselves?" Bryce swallowed hard, his bravado cracking. "Chief." "That's Chief Vance," Ezekiel interrupted, his voice cold as steel. "And I expect an answer." Calvin straightened, his face reddening. "It's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," Ezekiel snapped, his eyes locking onto Calvin. "You dragged me into the center of this town, tied me to a lamppost, and made a spectacle of me, all without knowing who I was. Or maybe you did know, and you thought you could get away with it anyway. Which is it?" Neither man answered. The room was thick with tension, the other officers staring at their boots or the walls, avoiding Ezekiel's gaze. Ezekiel took a step forward, his voice rising. "This is the department I've inherited. A department that bullies civilians, covers for each other, and makes a mockery of the badge." Crowley shifted in the back of the room, his expression tight. Ezekiel turned to him, his tone cutting. "And you let this happen under your watch?" Crowley opened his mouth to speak, but Ezekiel didn't give him the chance. "Enough," Ezekiel said, his voice ringing with finality. "Tanner, Ross, hand over your badges. Now." Bryce hesitated, his hand hovering near his badge. "Wait, Chief, you can't just." "I can. And I just did," Ezekiel said sharply. "And if either of you has a problem with it, I'll be happy to bring the state police in to help resolve it." Calvin's face twisted with anger, but he didn't argue. Both men finally unpinned their badges and set them on the table. Ezekiel picked them up, his expression unyielding. "This isn't just about them," he said, turning to address the rest of the room. "This is about all of you. From this moment forward, this department operates by the book. No more shortcuts. No more backroom deals. And no more treating the people of this town like they're beneath you." His eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "If anyone has a problem with that," Ezekiel said, "you know where the door is." No one moved. By the time the meeting ended, the weight of Ezekiel's words hung over the department like a storm cloud. Bryce and Calvin were escorted out, their desks cleared and lockers emptied. Crowley retreated to his office, but Ezekiel knew it wouldn't be long before he made his next move. After the meeting, as the room cleared, Harper lingered, her posture hesitant. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. "Chief Vance," she said, handing him a folder, "I thought you might want to see this. I've been going through old reports. There's more to what happened yesterday than just Tanner and Ross." Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he took the folder. "And you're showing this to me because?" "Because someone needs to," she replied simply. "And I think you're the first person who might actually do something about it." Ezekiel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Officer Harper. I'll take it from here." Ezekiel sat at his desk, looking over the files Grace Harper had brought him. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time the pieces were falling into place. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. The reckoning had only just begun. Ezekiel Vance stared at the folder Grace Harper handed him. It was thick, too thick for a town this small. He opened it slowly, letting the weight of its contents settle over him like the heavy Mississippi air outside. Pages of reports, handwritten notes, and faded photographs spilled out across his desk. "Where'd you find this?" Ezekiel asked, his voice low but sharp. Grace shifted on her feet, clearly uneasy. "I was going through the archives after Tanner and Ross left. Figured I should get familiar with what's been buried over the years. Didn't take long to find this shoved in the back of the filing cabinet. No labels. No case numbers. Just forgotten." Ezekiel scanned the first page, a complaint filed 5 years ago by a woman named Linda Watts. She claimed she'd been pulled over late at night, harassed and threatened. The officer's name, Bryce Tanner. He flipped to the next report. Different name, Carl Jenkins, but the same story. Intimidation, planted evidence, and an arrest that never made it to court. The cases piled up, too many to brush off as coincidence. "Did you read all of this?" Ezekiel asked. Grace nodded. "Enough to know it's bad. Real bad." "And Ross?" She swallowed. "Looks like he was more muscle than brains. Tanner did most of the paperwork, or covered it up, I should say. But Ross was right there with him every time. They weren't working alone, though." Ezekiel's eyes snapped up from the papers. "Who else?" Grace hesitated, then tapped a sheet near the bottom of the pile. It was a list of signatures, officers signing off on questionable arrests and evidence logs. Several names repeated, but one stood out: Deputy Chief Hank Crowley. Ezekiel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He'd been in Rustwood less than a week, and already the rot went deeper than he'd thought. Hank Crowley. The man had been running the department for years before Ezekiel showed up. Technically, Crowley had been acting chief until Ezekiel's appointment was finalized. That made him second in command and dangerously entrenched. "Where's Crowley now?" Ezekiel asked. Grace checked her watch. "Left early today. Said he wasn't feeling well." Ezekiel almost laughed. "I'll bet he wasn't." He stood, gathering the files and tucking them into his bag. "Keep this between us for now," he said. "I don't want Crowley or anyone else knowing we're on to them." Grace nodded, her jaw tightening. "What's the plan, Chief?" Ezekiel met her eyes. "We're going to clean house." By the time Ezekiel left the station, the sun was dipping below the tree line, turning the sky a deep shade of orange. The streets were quieter than usual, too quiet. Word had spread about Bryce and Ross, and the town was holding its breath, waiting to see what happened next. Ezekiel walked slowly, letting his presence be noticed. He passed the diner where Bryce and Ross had first singled him out, the windows dark and empty now. Down the block, a group of teenagers loitered near the gas station, their phones lighting up their faces as they whispered and pointed in his direction. He let them look. Let them wonder. When he reached his truck, he wasn't surprised to see a figure leaning against the hood. Hank Crowley. The deputy chief had the look of a man who'd spent too much time behind a desk soft around the edges, but still carrying himself like someone used to being obeyed. He tipped his hat as Ezekiel approached. "Evening, Chief." Hank. Ezekiel didn't slow down, opening the driver's side door and tossing the bag of files onto the seat. "Something I can help you with?" Crowley chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think we both know that's the wrong question." Ezekiel shut the door and turned to face him. "Then what's the right one?" Crowley's smile faded. "How much do you really want to dig, Vance? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've already kicked up enough dust to choke this whole town." Ezekiel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe it's about time this town got a breath of fresh air." Crowley's jaw twitched, but he held his ground. "You don't know this place. Don't know how it works. You think you can come in here and change things overnight. This town doesn't change. It survives. And it survives because people like me keep it running." "People like you?" Ezekiel's voice sharpened. "You mean people who turn a blind eye? People who protect bullies like Tanner and Ross? Or people who help them cover up their messes?" Crowley's eyes flickered, but he didn't back down. "You've got a good thing here, Vance," he said. "A badge, a title, and a chance to settle down. You really want to throw all that away because a couple of hotheads got too rough with an outsider?" Ezekiel leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not here to settle down. I'm here to tear this place apart and rebuild it brick by brick if I have to." Crowley's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then I guess we're at an impasse." "Looks that way." Crowley pushed off the truck and walked away, whistling an off-key tune. Ezekiel waited until he was out of sight before getting into the cab and locking the doors. He didn't notice the spray-painted words on the windshield until he turned on the wipers. "Leave." The red paint streaked across the glass, but Ezekiel didn't flinch. Instead, he put the truck in gear and drove back to the station. He had work to do. Ezekiel Vance stood in his office at the Rustwood Police Department, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above him buzzing like a distant storm. The red spray paint from his windshield earlier that night still lingered in his mind, but it wasn't fear that settled in his chest. It was resolve. The files Grace Harper had uncovered were spread across his desk. Reports of harassment, intimidation, false arrests, an entire web of corruption that had been allowed to fester under Hank Crowley's watch. Bryce Tanner and Calvin Ross were just the tip of the spear. The infection ran deeper, and Ezekiel had spent the better part of the night piecing it all together. Now it was time to cut it out. The morning came heavy and gray, clouds pressing low against the horizon like a lid about to blow off a boiling pot. Ezekiel's arrival at the station drew stares. Officers paused mid-conversation, the tension in the air so thick it could have choked them. Grace was already waiting for him in the main hall, her eyes sharp and steady. "You ready for this?" Ezekiel nodded. "You briefed the state investigators?" "They're 15 minutes out," she said. "Unmarked cars. Plainclothes. They'll come through the back entrance." "Good." Ezekiel's eyes swept over the room, landing on the officers who had signed off on Bryce and Calvin's dirty reports. Most of them were shifting nervously, whispering to one another. Crowley, however, sat in his office behind the glass window, calm and unbothered like a spider in the center of its web. Ezekiel stepped into the center of the room and cleared his throat. The noise died instantly. "Listen up," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "As of this morning, an official investigation into this department's practices has begun. The state police are en route, and they'll be conducting interviews with every officer here." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Ezekiel raised a hand, silencing them. "If any of you have something to say, if you've seen something or done something you know was wrong, now's the time to come clean. Because once those doors open, there won't be second chances." Eyes darted across the room. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one stepped forward. "Fine," Ezekiel said, his voice cold. "Then let's get this over with." As the first plainclothes investigators slipped into the building, Ezekiel made his way to Crowley's office. The deputy chief was leaning back in his chair, sipping coffee like it was just another Monday. You're making a mistake, Crowley said before Ezekiel even had the chance to speak. Ezekiel shut the door behind him. Funny. I was just about to say the same thing. Crowley smirked, setting his cup down. You think you can tear this place apart and still walk away unscathed? These people trust me. They've trusted me for years. You're just a passing storm. Ezekiel stepped closer, placing the folder of complaints on Crowley's desk and flipping it open. You call this trust? Threatening civilians? Planting evidence? Turning this town into your own personal fiefdom? Crowley's smile faltered, but only for a second. You think anyone's going to believe a man like you over me, a stranger in their town? Ezekiel leaned in, his voice a low growl. They don't need to believe me. They just need to believe the evidence. And I've got plenty. Crowley's eyes flickered toward the door as footsteps approached. The investigators. You can still walk out of this, Hank, Ezekiel said, straightening up. Turn yourself in. Cooperate. Maybe you keep some dignity intact. But Crowley wasn't interested in dignity. He lunged to his feet, shoving past Ezekiel and storming into the hall. Crowley's outburst didn't go unnoticed. The investigators moved quickly, cutting him off before he could make it to the exit. Officers watched, frozen, as their former leader was cuffed and led out the front door. The sound of cameras clicking filled the air. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, watching as Crowley's reign came to an end. Bryce and Calvin might have been the muscle, but Crowley was the architect of the corruption. And now that he was gone, the foundation was crumbling. The other officers began stepping forward, some to confess, others to distance themselves from the mess. Grace kept the process organized, directing interviews and logging statements. By the end of the day, half the department was either suspended or under investigation. The rest looked like ghosts, pale and shaken, their confidence shattered. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Rebuilding never is. Ezekiel had to bring in officers from surrounding towns to fill the gaps, retraining those who stayed and rewriting the rules from the ground up. It wasn't just about the police department, though. The town itself had changed. People who once turned a blind eye were speaking up, asking questions, demanding better. Ezekiel made it a point to show his face around town, not just as the chief but as a neighbor. He stopped by Maggie's place for coffee, shook hands at the farmer's market, and sat in on town meetings. Slowly the stares turned into nods. The whispers softened. One evening, Ezekiel found himself back at the lamppost in the town square, the same one Bryce and Calvin had chained him to. It looked different now, stripped of its symbolism, just another part of the landscape. Grace joined him, hands in her pockets. Feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? She said. Ezekiel nodded. But we're still here. She smiled. And so is this town. Thanks to you. Ezekiel didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out the photo of his son, Andre, and looked at it one more time. This isn't about me, he said finally. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. Grace looked at the photo and then back at him. I think you've done that. Ezekiel took a deep breath, feeling the weight in his chest finally start to lift. The fight wasn't over, it never really was, but for the first time since stepping into Rustwood, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.